Trump's first 6 months in office, and we were just saying it's been a bit of a ride, quite chaotic days as we haven't seen before. But before we get to that, I thought we can address what is actually happening in Ukraine, as obviously the front lines are now falling apart faster and faster, it seems, and a peace agreement seems more and more impossible. And the question appears to be if the war will end by a defeat on the battlefield or a collapse in the political system, at least from my standpoint. So I'm very happy to get your take what is actually happening in Ukraine these days, because there has been a gradual unraveling for a while, but what's happening now seems to be something new.
Just to pick up on that, I was looking at the Kyiv Independent, which always puts the best possible spin on what's happening on the battlefield. And they had an article on Pokrovsk, and the person who wrote it had gone there for a visit. And it said explicitly in the article that this will probably be the last visit to Pokrovsk by someone from the Kyiv Independent. And in effect, that person was saying that Pokrovsk is going to fall. And as we all know, Pokrovsk looks like it's going to fall rather quickly and rather easily. You have the sense that if this battle for Pokrovsk had taken place a year ago or 2 years ago, it would be a knockdown, drag-out battle. And that the Russians would have great difficulty just penetrating into the city. But that is not what is happening here. The defenses in Pokrovsk are tenuous at best. They may put up something of a fight, but it's not going to last that long. And of course, similar things are happening all along the front. And as Alexander has pointed out on numerous occasions, as you move further west, the defensive positions that the Ukrainians will be fighting from are much less effective than the defensive positions they have been fighting for. This is why they have fought like wild dogs to defend these cities and these positions in the easternmost parts of Ukraine, because those are the most, those are positions that are the most suitable for defense. So once places like Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar fall, the Russians are going to have a much easier time of it. And this is all happening at a time when the Ukrainian army is unraveling. And just to put a finer point on what Alexander said, I think there's sort of two dimensions to this. One is the material dimension. I mean, they have a shortage of shells, they have a shortage of armored vehicles, they're badly outnumbered in terms of drones, they don't have any glide bombs. The Russians have an abundance of glide bombs. If you look at the balance of infantry on the ground, it decisively favors the Russians, and I mean decisively. So that's the sort of tremendous material disadvantage that the Ukrainians are facing. But then there's the psychological dimension to this, which one could argue is the key. I think the Ukrainians are not simply getting desperate and deeply depressed because they're having trouble on the battlefield. I think if you hypothesize what the future looks like, what kind of support you can expect from the Trump administration going forward, how could you possibly be anything but profoundly depressed? The Biden pipeline is going to dry up very soon. That can't go on forever. And Trump has made it clear that he's not going to open up a new pipeline with a substantial number of weapons in it. Even if he wanted to do it, in theory, he couldn't do it in practice because we don't have the weapons to give. And all this talk about the Europeans filling the void is just nonsense. That's not going to happen. So if you're a Ukrainian fighter, you're going to say to yourself, what's the purpose of dying in a war that we're going to lose anyway? Why should I continue to fight? This is a lost cause. You could make an argument that maybe we can pull out a victory a year ago or 2 years ago. I know all of us didn't think you could make an argument, but a number of people thought you could make a plausible case. But anybody who's arguing that the Ukrainians can, stem the tide now and even reverse the tide is living in a dream world. And I think, that people on the front lines tend to be realists. There's nothing that focuses one's mind like someone shooting at you and trying to kill you. And, you begin to calculate what's going on here and where this is all headed. Anyway, all of this is to say, I would think that the psychological damage here, which of course is related to the material situation, I don't want to deny that, but the psychological dimension and the material dimension combined make this a hopeless situation for the Ukrainians.
What is really intensified over the past few weeks is the drones and the missiles. It used to be a big deal when 40, 50 drones were sent in one night. Now it seems to fluctuate between 500 and 700 over the past 2-3 weeks. It's quite extraordinary. And also with the missiles being launched, there hardly seems to be any functional missile defense left. That is, that the Russians seem to be able to target whatever they can, and there seems to be improved intelligence as well. I'm not sure if there's Ukrainians who can see where this is going, and they're making deals or passing over information, but the amount of production facilities which are being hit is quite extraordinary. So the whole point then is that the gap between the Russians and the Ukrainians, it keeps growing, and I'm not seeing how any of this growing gap can even be reduced. The Europeans talk about buying missile defense from America, but the Europeans don't really have the money. The Americans don't have the weapons. The Ukrainians can't operate it. And even if there were, nothing can stop these hundreds of drones being sent all the time. And it looks as if they're moving towards a crack, which the Russians are preparing for. That is, that the Russians are now preparing this huge amount of troops in the rear, and they're even expanding the front lines, further thinning out and taking advantage of Ukrainian weakness. And when a major crack comes, such as in Pokrovsk, then or Konstantinivka or Chasiv Yar, then it looks like the Russians will be in a position to really take huge advantage of it and try to make this unravel the entire front line. So it's just this Pokrovsk thing as well, how quickly this is happening, especially coming in from the northeast. There's reports of Russians arriving at the defensive positions for the Ukrainians with these small groups of 5 to 12 men, and then there's no people there. So what could have been well-fortified positions is just being not even overrun. They're coming, and they're not actually defended. So I think crack can come sooner now rather than later.
I think if you look at the Russians from February 2022, when the war broke out, up until now, what you see is that they started off more or less on their back foot. They were not in great shape, but they have rationalized things in truly impressive ways in terms of raising troops, training troops, employing troops, and then in terms of spinning up the industrial base. Just very impressive. And I think if you look at the tactics and the strategy on the battlefield, I believe they've gone to great lengths to minimize the number of Russian casualties. And that's why all this talk about, 1 million Russian dead or whatever is just pure nonsense. The Russians have not been engaged in human wave tactics. They've come up with very clever tactics to minimize the number of casualties. Of course, lots of people are still going to die given the nature of this war. But at the same time, I think the numbers are not that high on the Russian side. And it's just a very impressive performance. If you look at the Ukrainians, it's not so much the Ukrainians that I would be critical of in terms of the trajectory over time, although they've had a lot of problems. The real trouble is with the West and with the United States. If you're going to get a situation where the West is providing a huge amount of support to the Ukrainians, in a very important way, providing the backbone of support for the Ukrainians, the Americans have to take the lead. right? Because otherwise you have huge collective action problems. And plus, the United States has so much weaponry and is so wealthy. And during the Biden years, we took the lead. It's very clear. If you look at the Ramstein Group and how it operated, we were in the driver's seat. We made things happen. And that made the Ukrainians more effective and much to the chagrin of to the Russians. It made them, Ukrainians, a match for the Russians on the battlefield for quite a period of time. But what's happened with Trump is not just suddenly cut off all aid to Ukraine, but he has slowly but steadily removed the Americans from the leadership position, while at the same time saying that he'll go along with the Biden pipeline until all that material and economic support goes away. But he's not going to open up another pipeline. The Europeans are going to have to do that. And the Europeans can't solve the collective action problems. And plus, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the money, and so forth and so on. So I think if you look at the West plus Ukraine, it's really the West that's sort of de-rationalizing. Well, if you look on the other side of the divide, the Russians have impressively rationalized their war effort over time. And I think in a very important way, that sort of gets at the essence of what's going on here.
I think it's the need, though, to portray the Russians as simply wanting to present their motivation for simply being territory from day one. I think in the West, many of us have fooled ourselves because from this perspective, it looked as if the Russians were quite hopeless in the beginning. But as we know, when they did enter, at least what I hear, they were quite convinced that they wouldn't have to actually fight a war. They would introduce all these troops within the first few weeks. The Ukrainians would see the Russians would be serious. They would sit down in Istanbul. They would negotiate a deal where Ukraine would commit to neutrality. NATO would also accept this, that there would be no de facto NATO membership. NATO would pull out, and you could have a Minsk 2+ or whatever it might be. But I think what the Russians did when they realized this could not happen is they readjusted their army for a war of attrition. So, and if you're going to destroy the Ukrainian army, which NATO has spent so many years building up, and pouring in all these weapons, is going to be a very bloody affair, and they need a lot of weapons and a lot of soldiers. So they did approach this in a very, I guess, a rational manner. But I did want to ask the two of you about the possibility for peace now, because I, for one, was a bit optimistic when Trump took over. 6 months ago, he spoke of Ukraine having to accept neutrality. He also said we have to recognize there has to be territorial concessions as a result of the past 3 years. But now he's back at talking about an unconditional ceasefire, which doesn't really address the political issues, then primarily the neutrality issue. What is, well, I guess a very simple question is the time for peace done? Is it has that possibility been thrown out the window? I don't see a pathway anymore for a peaceful settlement.
I make a couple points. I think there's no question that the Trump administration has pursued a chaotic policy toward Ukraine and toward Russia. One could argue they've pursued a chaotic policy on almost every issue, Middle East included. But just on Ukraine, the question of getting a peace agreement is a very simple one. The Russians have set down a set of terms. As we all know, they did that last June 14th. And those terms, at least the main elements of the deal that they spelled out, are non-negotiable, period. And we simply refuse to accept those terms. As best I can tell, we refuse, and here I'm talking about the United States and the West more generally, we refuse to acknowledge those terms. The whole discourse pays hardly any attention to those terms. What we talk about is a ceasefire. The Russians have said ad nauseum, no ceasefire, no ceasefire, no ceasefire, until you get a meaningful peace agreement, at least in principle, if not in writing. So there's no point in talking about a ceasefire, but that's all we ever talk about. And we don't talk about the terms. And if you don't talk about the terms that Putin has laid out, there's no point in talking because you have to accept those terms. The Russians insist on that. For the Russians, what's happening in Ukraine is an existential threat. The problem is that most people in the West can't get this through their thick skulls. They just don't understand that this is not about territorial grabs or the fact that Putin wants to be Peter the Great or whatever. This is dealing with an existential threat. NATO on Russia's doorstep in Ukraine is an existential threat. And the Russians, therefore, came up with a series of demands that are non negotiable. And until we accept those demands, which we're not, right, this one is not going to be settled peacefully. It's going to be settled on the battlefield. And the end result is you're going to get a frozen conflict. You're never going to get, in my opinion, I hope I'm wrong, but you're never going to get a meaningful peace agreement. And this conflict is going to go on, maybe not as a hot war, but as a frozen conflict for as far as the eye can see.
Yeah, I watched some of the discourse here in Europe, and it's I would just describe it as quite radical and irrational because now that they realize, yeah, the war is coming to an end, we can't continue this forever. What people are saying then, okay, we need to come up with that peace if this is the case, but it's always focused on what does Ukraine need, and we come up with this idea. Well, they need a proper deterrent, so we need to obviously fill up with a lot of military capabilities. There should be Europeans on the ground, all these things, but no one actually asks what does Russia need. This seems. They never discuss this. This is quite surprising, and especially given that Russia is winning, surely their terms should also be discussed. And I thought about this as well because I think you're very correct. But I think they can't discuss this because if they discuss, well, Russia can't live with NATO on its borders, then we're gonna have to accept some complicity in this causing this war, and it seems like the key component in the war narratives has been this unprovoked invasion. They just want to swallow up more territory and restore the Soviet Union. If we have to go back and accept, well, Russia invaded because they can't accept NATO in Ukraine, then not only did we help provoke this war, but also this could have been solved a long, long time ago. And indeed, we might even face the threat of considering Russian security concerns as somewhat reasonable, that we wouldn't want this either. And the ceasefire, again, it doesn't make any sense. The Russians invaded because they wanted neutrality. And after all the suffering they have also gone through, they finally come towards the end and they're winning the war. The solution is going to be to freeze without meeting any of the demands. They're back at square one. This is what they've been fighting for. And, also if you have ceasefire, where's the pressure? The only reason why the Ukrainians and the NATO countries would accept what are very high demands of the Russians is because they're winning the war. If you have a ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire, it's just there's no reason to accept any of the terms at all. But in the absence, though, of a peace agreement, what will Russia do?
Well, I think that is the big question. I mean, just a quick recap.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with everything you said. I was going to ask a question, which you, in a sense, answered, Alexander, but I'll ask it anyway. Maybe we can go into a bit more detail, and Glenn can give us his views on the question. I just start by saying that if you look at how the West treats this conflict, this is especially true in Europe, but it's true with many people in the United States on the hawkish side of the equation. A Russian victory is an existential threat to the West. Many people believe that. I don't believe that for 1 second, but many people do believe it. So let's assume that we're correct and that the Russians win, and it's clear that Ukraine has lost. This is going to be a devastating defeat for the West. Devastating defeat psychologically, given how much we've invested in this war and how we portray a Russian victory as an existential threat. So that raises the question in my mind, what are we going to do? What are people in the West going to do? Are they going to say, well, we lost, this sometimes happens, and we just have to accept there's a frozen conflict? Or are we just not going to quit? And if we just don't quit, what does that mean?
Well, I was from the American side. You heard something that could make you optimistic, but again, things change back and forth too often. Keith Kellogg, he made this interview. I forgot which channel, but he effectively argued that in a peace agreement, Russia would need some reassurances that NATO wouldn't enter Ukraine, and he suggested that within this framework, we also have to then look at NATO's future relationship with countries like Georgia and Moldova. We both probably saw this interview, and I thought this was interesting. It caused some pushback from the Europeans, because this broke with the narrative that the European security architecture had anything to do with Russian motivations. But my point is, I think that this could be one lesson. That is, okay, we had a war because the European security architecture essentially fell apart. It was unsustainable, the path we took from the 90s, and we can start to look for ways of pushing for a structure based on indivisible security. In other words, resolve the underlying causes. This is I'm not that optimistic because no one's speaking of the European security architecture anymore. Instead, again, since we're going back to the unconditional ceasefire, the premise there appears to be that this is simply a territorial issue, and I don't think Trump really understands the war, to be honest. And so I think the main view in Europe will probably be that the battle was lost, but the war still goes on. So this will become a new Cold War. We will, we'll get them at the end, just like the first time. We will eventually come out at the end because we got freedom and all of this. And there's going to be this more dangerous version of a Cold War, pump a little bit more weapon into opposition groups in Ukraine, or what remains. We have to confront the Russians in the Arctic. So instead of taking lessons from Ukraine in terms of seeking a more neutral position for Georgia and Moldova, as Keith Kellogg suggested, there's instead going to be push to increase Western presence and pull them into, if not NATO membership, at least the NATO orbit. And within this, if one buys into this premise that this is just a Russian territorial expansion and they were successful this time, we could get ideas like trying to liberate Belarus from Russian influence. It's quite interesting. If you drive through Lithuania, they have street signs. They actually have next to Belarus. They say, this direction is Minsk, and this is presently occupied by Russia. This is on the roads. When you drive, it's quite crazy. So if this view prevails, I think they can. I think we're just going to go into another Cold War where we, or alternatively, or additionally, also the idea that if we want to save face, we have to embrace the narrative, that double down on this narrative. You can say that we didn't actually lose because Russia wanted all of Ukraine and they only got 25%, or it could be much more. And indeed, this in a way was a victory because they paid a heavy human toll, and they were isolated internationally, meaning the West. And so this was kind of a victory for us anyways. Now, this could be a very attractive face-saving narrative, but again, it would mean that we're still doubling down on this premise that this was about territory. And I think this is why this war of narratives is so important, because if there isn't introduced any rationality into this, any reason, any willingness to address why this war began, we're going to learn all the wrong lessons. And I think, in my opinion, that's the direction we're going, where effectively, mindless hatred of Russia will be the new virtue.
2 quick points. One, Alexander said, and I agree completely, and I think you agree too, Glenn, based on what you just said, that the Russians will not take all of Ukraine, and you will end up in Western Ukraine with a rump state. And you want to think about what that means. In other words, it's not like Russia just completely conquers Ukraine, incorporates all of Ukraine, and the Ukraine problem, so to speak, is taken off the table. Ukraine remains. It's just a rump state. And the question we then have to ask ourselves is, what are relations between the West and that rump state going to look like? And I would bet that we will continue to maintain, we meaning the West, reasonably close, maybe even very close relations with that rump state. And that will be a source of huge trouble. Second point I would make is, if you watch what's going on in the Baltic and you listen to how people talk about Kaliningrad these days and the possibility of surrounding Kaliningrad with NATO forces, it sends shivers up your spine. I mean, don't these people understand that they're playing with fire? And anyway, I just take that. I hope I'm wrong here, but I take that as an indicator of how crazy the West may behave once this war comes to an end and we get a frozen conflict.
What will this mean for NATO? That's that would be interesting to me, because for some, then mainly the Americans, it looks as if they do still have an interest to normalize relations with Russia. As Alexander said, we don't. Well, the United States have to adjust to this multipolar world. They have to make priorities. They can't be everywhere at all times. When you have many centers of power, you don't want to push necessarily the Chinese and the Russians too close together. So it would make sense for the United States at least to have some bilateral relations with Russia, to shift its priorities and resources to Asia. But meanwhile, in Europe, you have, I would say, the Baltic states. They finally have the entire political West hating Russia as much as they do, and this is, I think, also for the Europeans, keeping NATO alive. You need that external adversary, and Russia plays that part quite well in the minds of the Europeans. So, if this war comes to an end now, what will this actually mean for NATO? It doesn't seem. I mean, it's not either it remains or it collapses. It could end up in some weaker form, but surely this is a wider collapse of the European security architecture. I would think so, at least, given how much the Europeans have invested in this. I mean, we threw everything in gambling on this idea of defeating Russia.
Well, I'll tell you, Glenn, if you read the papers these days, you see quite a few articles talking about nuclear deterrence for Germany. The Germans are talking to the French, and there's the whole question of whether the French nuclear deterrent can provide security for Germany. Even people in Germany are even talking about the possibility of Germany getting its own nuclear weapons. But they're basically saying that we can't count on the American nuclear umbrella anymore. And the American nuclear umbrella is at the heart of the security guarantee that is built into NATO. And if that is going away now, it's only going to erode further in the wake of a Ukrainian defeat and a Russian victory. So I think that America is no longer in a position, and it doesn't want to be in a position where it's providing security for Europe. It wants the Europeans to provide for their own security. We use that rhetoric. The Trump administration uses that rhetoric all the time. And you can disagree with it or agree with it, but the fact is, it's the way the Trump administration thinks. But once you go down that road, once you start talking about Europeans providing for their own security, then the American security umbrella, the American nuclear umbrella, goes away. And again, this is why the French and the Germans are talking about trying to figure out what's the best way to provide nuclear deterrence for Germany. So I think that the alliance will surely remain in name, but in terms of being a meaningful alliance, the way it has been since 1949, I don't think that's going to be the case moving forward. The problem the Europeans face, though, Alexander, is that the Trump administration wants out of Europe. And there are just real limits to what they can do to keep us in Europe. I think the Europeans would do almost anything to keep the American security umbrella over their head, which is another way to say they do almost anything to keep NATO intact. But I think they understand that with Donald Trump, it's a lost cause. And then all the logics that you just spun out begin to kick in. I'd make one quick point on this to illustrate how tricky this can all be. If you go back to the Cold War, when there really was a serious threat called the Soviet Union that the West faced, both France and Britain developed nuclear weapons. They had a nuclear deterrent. The British agreed to integrate their nuclear deterrent into NATO, which is basically a way of saying that the Americans controlled the British nuclear deterrent, which I think was a smart policy. But leaving that aside, the French, as you would expect, this is Gaullist France, absolutely refused to subordinate their nuclear arsenal to American control. So they actually pulled out of the military half of NATO in 1966. Most people don't realize this. I remember when I used to study the conventional balance in Europe, I could tell you all the forces that we had on our side, the Soviets had on their side, and the French were not included because they were not in the military part of the alliance. They remained in the political part. But this was driven in good part by the fact that the French did not want to subordinate their security, i.e. their nuclear deterrent, to NATO control, which meant American control. So you can see the British and the French had very different views at the time on how to provide nuclear deterrence for themselves. And this situation will be even worse now because there's no Soviet threat to, act as a glue.
Well, it's just hard to see how we can go back to the way things were. As again, John, you often speak of America as the pacifier, which I think is very correct. That without the United States, there the Europeans aren't going to have much of a cohesion. But also the Russian boogeyman to keep this external threat, to have everyone in line and be willing to make these concessions. I think this is also going to be weakened once the war is over if Russia simply communicates it's fed up with the West. It wants its main economic interests, political interests are in the East, and it shows more and more disdain and disinterest of the West. In other words, its weapons should still point west, but its economic ties should go east. But also in Europe, you're going to have some accountability once this war has been lost, and a lot of the war narratives are exposed for being fraudulent. And of course, we're having economic problems here. Especially in Germany, things aren't going well. This is also producing some social problems. We're having a struggle with political legitimacy from France, Germany, UK. There's I would at least characterize this as a legitimacy problems of many of the political elites. And it's just hard to see why the Europeans wouldn't turn on each other once this war comes to an end. And all these plans of, well, if the American leaves, Germany can militarize. But this is not, it is assuming that the rest of the Europeans will be comfortable with this this new Germany. And again, this is not the Germany of 5 years ago. This is a Germany which having huge economic problems, a Germany which now envisions prosperity through some military Keynesianism, wanting to be a huge military power in the center of Europe. Not everyone in Europe is quite comfortable yet with the Germans doing this. And also the growing disdain for political opposition, now banning the main opposition party in Germany. Germany talking openly about obtaining nuclear weapons. they're already backing genocide in Gaza, and now they want to be the leading power in Europe to confront Russia. This just the idea that this will simply be a new version of NATO, I'm not really buying it. I think I think this can fragment very quickly and become very unstable. But again, these are realities, though. The Americans will leave. I think more and more are seeing the Europe as having delayed what they should have done years ago.
And I think there are two factors at play that explain it. One is the Middle East, and the other is East Asia. The fact is that the United States has just got dragged into a war with Iran. We went to war on June 22nd, and by almost all accounts, that one is not finished. And we're joined at the hip with the Israelis, and the Israelis are fighting wars here, there, and everywhere. And we pay lots of attention to those wars. We're backing a genocide in Gaza, which is hugely consequential event for us and for the Trump administration in particular. So the focus is in a really big way on the Middle East. And of course, Israel, for all the reasons we fully understand, is of importance, great importance to the United States. So focusing on Israel has taken attention away from Europe and allowed us to drift away from Europe. And then there's East Asia. Thankfully, there is no crisis there, and there's no crisis on the horizon. But at the same time, the American newspapers are filled with stories about growing Chinese military strength in East Asia. China building a blue water navy, China becoming more aggressive in its behavior towards Taiwan, and so forth and so on. Sending a fleet around Australia and so forth and so on. So there's a sense that the Americans have to pay more attention to East Asia. And of course, they're now paying a huge amount of attention to the Middle East. And there is a limit to how many balls you can have in the air at the same time. And unsurprisingly, Europe is the one ball that is getting the least amount of play at this point in time. And that allows the commitment, the American commitment, to basically wither away. I mean, that's what's happening. Trump hasn't made a simple policy decision to end the American commitment to Europe. He's just letting it wither away, which I think, Alexander, fits with his chaotic way of doing business, right? He doesn't, even if he makes a concrete decision, he'll switch it the next day, then go back to the original decision the following day. But I think if you sort of look at what's happening in Europe, we're drifting away, and we're going to focus a lot more on the Middle East because of Israel and our commitment to Israel, and we're going to focus a lot more on East Asia.
I think the Europeans' prediction about what's going to happen with the United States, that they might be convinced to stay behind. I think they're misreading, because they're always very. I guess it's a very common problem in the world to focus excessively on the personality of leaders, and of course Trump is quite unique to this regard. But it is important to note that in the first administration of Trump, I mean, he's more of a transitional president. When he pulled the U.S. away from the JCPOA with Iran, this wasn't. It was seen as something radical. It's just Trump, but again, Biden didn't reverse it. He went very aggressively after China, seeking to crash its economy or prevent its technological rise. This didn't get changed under Biden either. So I think we overestimate how much of this is about Trump, and as opposed to what is more systemic or structural, given that the world is becoming multipolar, and as both of you said, there's priorities has to be made, and there's also a sense that it's not getting necessarily better. Economically, the whole post-World War II era, our economic system seems to be shaking in terms of it's just interest in things like U.S. treasuries or bonds. I think many feel that this system, as Musk would say, they're speeding towards bankruptcy. There has to be some reshuffling. And I think after Trump is gone, the idea that we're just going to go back to the way things were, it's very flawed. And I bring this up because it appears to me that European policy is just unlimited flattery and just wait him out. Just as Trump would say, kiss his ass as much as possible, and just get this 4 years over with, and then later on they can all write books about how they were able to manage Trump until he went away. But again, I think the policies will stick because it's not all about Trump. I think he's more. Some of it's Trump, but he's quite unique. But a lot of this is Trump being a symptom of something wider, and I think the Europeans are preparing themselves for this by fooling themselves.
Well,
before we finish off, I wanted to just ask about Trump's first 6 months in office. It hasn't gone as expected. I know this would be a massive topic as a final question, but how do you see this 6 months? Obviously, he didn't finish the war in Ukraine. I think he was a bit too ambitious. He wasn't really able to end the forever wars in the Middle East either. The whole America first principle appears to be challenged. The tariffs, which as I'm a bit of a Hamiltonian economic nationalist, so I'm not that opposed to tariffs. I see them as being an interesting instrument if they're very targeted towards some sectors for developing some technological sovereignty or industrial capabilities if they're mixed with subsidies. But again, this appears to only be used now as a big hammer against punishing, like a form of sanctions or economic coercion. So I think it's abused. But how are you guys interpreting his first 6 months? Can it continue like this for another 3.5 years?
I'll say a few words. Let me just start with the foreign policy front, which I think is not his biggest problem at the moment. But he's failed almost everywhere. He's failed in Ukraine/Russia, as we just talked about. Remember, he said he might even shut down the Ukraine war before he moved into the White House. He's not. He succeeded after 6 months. Then there is the Middle East. We're now in a war with Iran. Joe Biden had the good sense to avoid a war with Iran. The Israelis tried to bait us into a war on 2 occasions, and Biden didn't take the bait, and Trump did. We're still supporting the genocide in Gaza. The Israelis are still in southern Lebanon and in southern Syria, and we're supporting them there. And you want to remember, Trump went to war against Yemen and said he was going to deliver a decisive blow to the Houthis. And after about 30 days, he quit and said the Houthis won. And then there are the tariffs, which are hard to make sense of because he constantly goes from one point to another point to another point on the tariffs, and where this all ends up, who knows? But it doesn't strike the vast majority of people who study these issues that this is a smart way to do business with regard to tariffs. So I think if you look at his performance on the foreign policy front, it's actually dismal. But I think his biggest problems are at home. And I think this Jeffrey Epstein business is a huge problem for him. And it's a huge problem because the MAGA base is consumed by it, and they are very angry at Trump. And if you look at the polling figures on Trump, he is sinking rapidly in the polls. I was looking at a CBS poll before. This is of 18 to 29-year-olds. In February, he had a 55% approval rating and a 45% disapproval rating. 55% approval, 45% disapproval. In July, the approval is 28% and the disapproval is 72%. That's a 54-point swing. And there are other polls that show smaller swings, but not by much. And there's just a lot of anger in the land. And a lot of it has to do with the Jeffrey Epstein business, because the Jeffrey Epstein business says a lot about the governing elites in the United States. And this is an issue that concerns the MAGA base and a lot of other people who think the governing elites are not only incompetent, but deeply corrupt. And this is, causing Trump all sorts of problems because of his close affiliation with Jeffrey Epstein. And then there's the whole business of that big bill, that big, beautiful bill that he just got passed in Congress. I was actually shocked by that bill in large part because it has a huge downside for the MAGA base. It's rich people who really should like that bill, not, people who are struggling to get by, struggling to put food on the table and pay their rent and get health care. I don't think that bill helps at all on that front. In fact, I think it's going to hurt people. And I've talked to a few people who were big Trump supporters who are now not so sure when they try to get, Medicare and have all sorts of problems. They're not happy at all. And these were former Trump supporters. So I think that it is likely, these things are hard to call, and Trump does have this Teflon effect. But I think Trump is in trouble on the home front. And I think when you marry that with the situation I described in terms of foreign policy, he is not looking good after 6 months.
Yeah,
So look at just quickly, Glenn, if you look at the economic indicators, Alexander, the economy is moving along quite smoothly.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to add, I think, one shouldn't underestimate the stability of the American institutions, as you said, with all this political chaos, all this economic uncertainty, and still things are running. So it's, not to be underestimated. I also very much agree that, that all of this is now catching up. I think many people are willing to think that perhaps there's a great plan behind some of this. He's gonna end the Ukraine war, or he's gonna end the conflicts in the Middle East. It's we're not seeing the full picture yet. But when with the Epstein, I think it became so obvious that just the behavior and also the very blatant reversal and the way he even went after his own base when he trashing them as soon as people unrelated to this, but when Musk goes against the big beautiful bill, the way he's turning on his closest ones, Tucker Carlson, everyone who doesn't go along, he goes after very hard. I think this is where he's probably going to reach a wall. So no, it's a lot of until next time we speak, I'm sure the world will look very different by then. So anyways, any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Just one final point. When President Trump moved into the White House in January of this year, he confronted a series of extremely difficult problems to solve. And I think that if he was going to solve those problems, he needed to think really carefully about how to deal with each of them. And he needed to rely on experts. They could be experts of his choosing, but he needed to have people around him who really understood those problems. This is certainly true with regard to dealing with the Russians. But he did exactly the opposite. He thinks he's a genius and he by himself can solve almost any problem. And then to the extent that he brought people along with him, he brings someone like Steve Witkoff in. Witkoff knows hardly anything about international politics. He has hardly any experience. And Trump assigns him 3 different portfolios: the Russia portfolio, the Iran portfolio, and the Gaza portfolio. And you watch Witkoff operate in those early days, he has hardly any staff, if any staff, around him. And you just sort of scratch your head and say to yourself, how's this going to work? And then he brings in people like Mike Waltz, who he quickly fires, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth. I mean, this is not the A team. It just isn't. And again, I'm not making a judgment based on ideology. There are people on the right who are really very smart, know these issues that he could have brought along with him. But the end result is, we have this chaotic foreign policy, as Alexander described it, we meaning the United States. And it's peopled by individuals who are not part of the A team. And the end result is we're just in a heap of trouble. And there's no sign that we're going to get out of it anytime soon.
So, yes, to summarize, interesting times. Thank you both for your time. This has been very interesting.